In this lesson, we're going to highlight a very important feature of a valid argument, and this is known as the substitution principle, or the principle of substitution, if you want to use a different phraseology. So specifically in this lesson, we're going to recap the distinction between a valid and sound argument, recap on what it means for an argument to be valid, and then what it means for an argument to be sound, and then discuss what the substitution principle is and how it is a very interesting feature of valid arguments. So, as we already know, as already has been presented, an argument is valid such that if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. We know this already. And we can take this example here that we have already looked at before, which is premise 1, proposition 1, all men are immortal. Proposition 2, or premise 2, Socrates is a man, therefore the conclusion will be Socrates is immortal. Now, regardless of whether or not the premises are actually true or false, is something when we're looking at the soundness of an argument. But for the purposes of this particular argument, if we were to assume that the premises were true, if we were to assume that all men are immortal and that Socrates is a man, then the conclusion would have to be the case that Socrates is immortal. That's what a valid argument is. Well, and then as we know, a sound argument is one in which that is both valid. So it has to be valid, the premises have to logically entail the conclusion, and the premises have to also be true. So the previous argument we just looked at passes the test of validity, but it doesn't pass the test of soundness, because we know that all men are not immortal. So this would be a better example. Premise 1, all men are mortal. We know this to be true. We know that Socrates is a man, or if we want to be even more pedantic, we could say Socrates was a man. And then we can conclude that Socrates is mortal. This is a valid and a sound argument. So this brings us on to what we call the substitution principle. When it comes to the validity of an argument's being valid, its validity actually has nothing to do with the content of the premises and the conclusion, what the actual premises and conclusions are even about. All that validity really refers to is whether or not, given the set of premises that we have, these premises entail some kind of a conclusion. And this gives rise to an important principle. We call it the substitution principle. And it basically means what we can do is we can substitute the contents of a premise so long as the premises still have this same logical relationship, so that the contents of the premise, what we're actually talking about, may be different, but at the same time it still is valid, and still is just as valid for the exact same reasons as the previous argument. So let's take the following example. Premise 1, if it is raining, then I'd better take an umbrella. Premise 2, it is raining, or it's raining. Therefore the conclusion is, then I'd better take an umbrella. Or I'd better take an umbrella. So what do we have? Okay, the contents of these premises could just as easily be substituted for any other set of premises, so long as this logical relationship stays the same. And the logical relationship is, the first premise is what we call a conditional. Okay, it is an if-then statement. If something is happening, then I should do this thing. And then premise 2 is just confirming that the first thing is happening, and so therefore I should do this thing, is the conclusion. So if then, and then we have the other premises. We could substitute anything within this for this argument, and if we do this, the argument will still remain valid. So let's take an example. So we're going to use this previous argument, and then we're going to substitute it with the following. Premise 1, if interest rates are low, house prices will increase. Premise 2, interest rates are low, therefore, conclusion, house prices will increase. You can see here that the structure of the argument is exactly the same as the previous argument. However, the only thing that's different is the content of the premises, the thing that we're talking about. In the previous example, we were talking about whether or not it was raining and whether or not we could take an umbrella. And in this example, we're talking about if interest rates are low, then house prices will increase. The same exact principle applies. We have substituted the contents of the premise. So, yeah, as it is mentioned here, despite having totally different premises, it is still just as valid as the previous one for the same reason. They have the exact same logical relationships. So this really allows us to, instead of using, for example, and using examples like if it is raining, I should take an umbrella, or if interest rates are low, then house prices will increase, we can use entities as sort of placeholders for these valid arguments. So let's take the previous two arguments and write them in a more of a logical form, okay, more of a generalized idea as well. So it can be written as if A then B, A therefore B. This is the exact same structure as the previous arguments, because we have just substituted things like raining and taking an umbrella for A and B. If we were to put the original premises back in, A would be it is raining, okay. B would be I should take an umbrella. So the original argument was if it is raining, then I should take an umbrella. It is raining, therefore I should take an umbrella. This is just a good way of using some kind of logical notation just to try and forget about the actual contents of the argument and really focus on the logical relationships. It's also a very good way of looking at when you are arguing with somebody. Sometimes the contents of the premises can cause people to stumble upon arguments that are invalid. So you could actually make an argument that is invalid and sort of sneak the invalidity past the person you're arguing with because the premises are, referring to a certain thing. Whereas if we then take this argument and then break it down into its component parts, like what is happening here, then we can see whether or not the argument is valid or not. So that's really the purpose of the substitution principle. And we're also going to use these kinds of placeholders, these kinds of entities, the ifs, A's, then B's, okay, to look at valid forms of inference, which will be the focus of the next lesson.